This is going to be a video that I'm certain will cause some controversy, to say the least. You see, I've only played one Dragon Quest game all the way to the end, mostly because I just don't have the time for video games as much anymore, sadly. That game is Dragon Quest V: Hand of the Heavenly Bride, of course. However, I've played a fair bit of Dragon Quest III: Seeds of Salvation, Dragon Quest IV: Chapters of the Chosen, and Dragon Quest XI: Echoes of an Elusive Age. And by a fair bit, I mean that I've played each of them for, like, at least an hour. That's not really a fair bit, I guess. But I know the full story of each game, in addition to Dragon Quest VIII: Journey of the Cursed King, though that one I have never played in any capacity. With that out of the way, to give you a sense of perspective, I've completed Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy IX. And I've played Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy XIII, and Final Fantasy XIV. Wow. That's a lot of games for a series that has final... I'm not going to make that joke. Literally everyone makes that joke when they talk about that series. You might think this means I have a massive bias for the Final Fantasy games. And that would be absolutely true, because I played most of them in some very formative years. Final Fantasy IV, the after years, even gave me one of my first existential crises, which I'll save for another time, though I actually hate that game. Even so, in this video we're going to explore the strange fact that, despite the fact I've played more of Final Fantasy, and played it more in my formative years, I like Dragon Quest better as a series on the whole. Hell, the Final Fantasy games I like more than the Dragon Quest games that I like. But Dragon Quest is just a lot more consistent in its style and tone. Allow me to explain. For the past 30 years, Dragon Quest has had the same composer, Koichi Sugiyama, and the same art director, Akira Toriyama, who is better known as the guy who did Dragon Ball and Chrono Trigger. But this isn't the only thing that leads to a feeling of cohesion throughout the Dragon Quest series. Not only does the art style always stay the same, but every story has nearly the same premise, barring Dragon Quest V, of course. Dragon Quest V is an incredible outlier. In most games, the Chosen One sets out on a quest to do something and save the world, which is a high fantasy setting of some kind with a comedic and whimsical cast of characters that fit its art style well. Of course, there's a lot of variation in each individual story because that's not a very specific prompt, and many stories use that kind of prompt, but the basic premise is the same. While some might think it's a detriment, I think it's a strength. You always know what you're getting into when you're playing a Dragon Quest game. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, is nearly always vastly different. The first 5 games all center around crystals of the elements, but even then your quest is not exactly the same. For example, Final Fantasy I is merely to collect these crystals, whereas Final Fantasy IV's quest changes a lot, but ultimately it's to stop Golbez from doing, something. I don't really remember what Golbez wanted to do, to be honest. Though the last time I played Final Fantasy IV wasn't that long ago, it was only about a year, the game doesn't make it super clear what his motivations are. While Nobuo Uematsu and Yoshitaka Amano did the music and art, respectively, for the series for all of the first 6 games, 7 dropped Amano and 10 dropped Uematsu. This leads to there being 3 major eras of Final Fantasy, 1 through 6, which are mostly fantasy-oriented, 7 through 10, which are fantasy mixed with contemporary and even futuristic science fiction elements, besides 9, which is a return to form, and 11 through 15, which have dropped a lot of the fantasy elements in favor of the futuristic ones. I don't really have a problem with this as a concept. I just think that the Final Fantasy games don't really have any major connective tissue anymore. Like, when you look at Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy for the NES, what similarities do you see there that might make you think they're the same series, title notwithstanding? What says Final Fantasy about both of them? Nothing, really, other than there being a fantastical quest in both. The gameplay has even been changed significantly over the course of the series. It's no longer turn-based and hasn't been for quite a while since at least Final Fantasy XII. I wouldn't say this is a bad thing, but it definitely doesn't feel like Final Fantasy anymore. Final Fantasy has an issue of core identity on its hands, much like Sonic the Hedgehog, although to a lesser extent. whereas Dragon Quest has kept the same themes and gameplay mechanics over the entire course of its near 40-year run. This consistency makes it easier for me to determine that I'll be able to enjoy a Dragon Quest game and leads me to prefer it as a series on the whole, and I think that it achieves what it sets out to do a lot more easily due to its more consistent mission statement. However, I will say that the sheer ambition of Final Fantasy often leads to games that I enjoy more because they have a greater impact on me. Dragon Quest V Hand of the Heavenly Bride is one of my favorite games of all time. That I can say without question. Like, I've had videos about that game on the back burner for a while now. But the other Dragon Quest games aren't really that important to me at all. I like them better on the whole than most Final Fantasy games, but ultimately they didn't stick with me that much. And that's okay. That doesn't mean they're games that aren't serviceable to me or anything. I plan on revisiting them someday regardless, and maybe I'll even find a new favorite when I do. After all, I haven't finished any of them besides the aforementioned Dragon Quest V. Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy IX are so important to me that they changed my entire life forever. Both games struck me in deep emotional places that I didn't even know I had at the time. I loved Final Fantasy VI so much, I wrote a 780-page novelization of it that I hope to publish someday. It was my favorite game for a very long 5 years without question. The tragedy of the story and its huge cast of characters that it balances, admittedly not expertly, but better than I expected any game to when I was 12 years old, is incredible. Around 10 of the 14 characters have interesting stories to them, and there's also Umaro the Yeti, who is quite funny. This opinion is, I wouldn't say it's unpopular, but I certainly don't see it a lot. But Cyan Garamonde is one of the greatest video game characters ever written. A tragedy, a befuddling tragedy of a man who lost everything, yet still soldiers on to find purpose in a dying world. It's beautiful. It's a technical marvel for its time, and it still holds up today. Final Fantasy IX, on the other hand, is a story about mortality. Its themes are so interwoven throughout the story and gameplay in fantastic ways. The character of Amarant, for example, has to realize that a big part of life are the connections you make with other people, and as a result of that, all of his abilities are about buffing and supporting other party members in order to show him that life would be easier if he let other people work with him. This kind of fantastic narrative gameplay marriage is beautiful to me and one of the best examples of how this medium can elevate storytelling to a greater degree. But that's not why I love Final Fantasy IX, that's just a snippet of it. I love Final Fantasy IX because of the character of Vivi Ornitier, who is a black mage with only 1 year to live. What does one do with only 1 year to live? Final Fantasy IX explores this question, well, I wouldn't say flawlessly, but definitely very well and better than almost any other game I've seen do it. It could do with some more focus. It brought me to tears on my first playthrough though, so that's something really commendable for a video game. Rarely does a game do that. I love Dragon Quest V Hand of the Heavenly Bride. I love the story. I love how much emotional pain it put me through, which is a video that I really want to make at some point. However, it just didn't affect me in the same way these two Final Fantasy games did. It did not change my character on as large of a scale. So ultimately what I'm saying with this video is that I like Dragon Quest more on a franchise level, but I like Final Fantasy more on a game-by-game basis if I really like the individual game. Of course, I do think that Final Fantasy has more misses than hits, but when it hits, it really hits. And really, there's a time for both series, and I wouldn't say either one is more fun for me than the other. This has been Arcagent Everlasting, appreciator of JRPGs, signing off. Thank you for watching.